You're very welcome to this Climate Finance Week session on aircraft leasing and the ESG agenda. This session is brought to you in association with Aircraft Leasing Ireland, and we're very kindly being hosted by AIB in their studios here in Molesworth Street. So the aviation sector is a really important global contributor to economies, and Ireland is no different. And in today's session, along with my very esteemed guests, we're going to look at, from an aviation lessor's perspective, what are the key drivers and levers in the ESG agenda. My name is Shane O'Reilly. I'm a director in KPMG Sustainable Futures, a dedicated team based out of Dublin here, servicing clients right across the public and private agenda on their ESG needs and wants. So maybe I'll just hand over to our panel now to give their introduction, and we'll kick off the session from there. So over to you, Jan.
Thank you, Shane. Jan Melgard. My day job is that I'm the executive chairman of FPG Amentum. And then on top of that, I'm also chairing the Sustainability Committee of Aircraft Leasing Ireland, or ALI as we call it, on a daily basis.
Thank you, Jan. And Orla, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Jane. My name is Orla Benson, and I work with a company called SMBC Aviation Capital. We are a large leasing company, and we manage about 700 aircraft altogether. So we lease around the world, and my specific role is to work in our innovation hub in the Nest. So that's what we call our innovation hub. So I'm tasked with that whole implementation around ESG. So a very exciting time for the industry and for the company as well.
Thanks, Orla. Wonderful. And Chris.
Thanks, Shane. My name is Chris Brown. I head our Aviation Strategy Hub at KPMG and also chair our global working group on future flight, which increasingly includes decarbonisation as a main theme.
Great, thank you. You're all very welcome. So maybe, Jan, I might open with you. I mentioned in my opening introduction that the aviation is such an important component of global economies, but it's not without its challenges, particularly when it comes to climate-related emissions. You might, for our viewers, give some indication of what ALI is and how the ESG agenda has made its way into the organisation.
Happy to. Let's start out with Aircraft Leasing Ireland. It was formed a few years ago, and basically the purpose was, or it is, a trade organisation where we are addressing issues which are common to our industry. And that effectively also brings us to the ESG agenda. I mean, you said it yourself. I mean, this is a challenge to our industry, and I would take it a step further. It's by far the biggest challenge we are facing as an industry. And what we concluded last year was to effectively start working the ESG agenda on Aircraft Leasing Ireland basis, so to speak. So we are in a situation today where we are facing the biggest challenge we've ever had as an industry, and we are working it at two levels. One is that each member is working it for that particular corporation, and of course that's very critical. But it's equally important that we also at Aircraft Leasing Ireland level work it. So that's really where the ESG agenda fits into Aircraft Leasing Ireland. Wonderful,
thank you. Yeah. And maybe Orla, I might bring you in from an investor perspective. And wider stakeholders. From where you sit in SMBC, what are the criteria? What are people asking you in relation to the ESG agenda?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of stakeholders, obviously, that we are talking to about the ESG agenda. The principal ones, I suppose, are on the investor side and also on the customer side as well. And I guess from the investor side, ESG was probably not at the top of the agenda in the last couple of years, but has definitely moved up to be one of the top items. We're certainly, our investor relations team are experiencing that it's really moved up to one of the key items for discussion. And that's all really positive. And I guess the requirement from our side of things has been, we launched our ESG strategy last year in December. And in that we highlighted our ambitions where we wanted to disclose in line with TCFD reporting, and we got a lot of feedback from investors at the time to say, that this was positive. They were really positive about seeing this development within the aircraft leasing sector. And I guess allied to what Jan is saying there about the charter, the ALI sustainability charter, this will be something as well that we will certainly move ahead and will be positive for investors to see. So, I mean, I guess when you look at sustainability-linked finance as well, it's tricky in aviation. It is deemed to be a hard-to-abate sector. But there are ways and means now about looking around that and making sure that we are transparent and we are disclosing in terms of what our ambitions and also what we want to do and KPIs from that perspective. So, I'm thankful that as well we're seeing from the customer side that more scrutiny also. From the airline side, when their RFPs have been issued, we've seen a number of airlines coming forward and also looking for our ESG credentials. So many Danish ones as well from that side of things. But, again, we welcome this type of scrutiny because we're prepared for it. And I think that's the way the dial can move. If companies like ourselves and the companies that we work are putting us under that level of scrutiny and pressure to deliver on what we've said we will do.
Perfect, thank you. And from the ESG strategy perspective that was launched last year, and for people who may not be overly familiar with the leasing sector in general, would it be fair to say that the environmental side of it is the lion's share of what people are asking about, but it's not the sum of everything really?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, so much has happened in aircraft, the aviation industry and in aircraft leasing in the past few years. And obviously with the impact of COVID, that has been particularly tricky. And then with the war in Ukraine as well. So there have been many challenges for aviation in general. And I think that the real sense was, prior to these type of challenges happening, that maybe the environmental piece would fall down the agenda, but thankfully it hasn't. It still remains top of mind. And when you listen to and you see those videos that played prior to this discussion, that's what keeps it top of mind. It's entering into our living rooms on the news every day. We see the crisis across the world. And we know that aviation is such a strong industry. It's got so much to contribute from a social perspective, from a tourism, livelihood, economic perspective. But at the same time, it has to be sustainable. So that's the way that we feel that we need to move forward. And aircraft leasing, we don't fly the aircraft. We facilitate airlines around the world to fly the aircraft. So there's kind of that question of that one step removed from actually operating the aircraft themselves. But as facilitators, we have a huge role and a huge responsibility to make sure that we're also playing our part in how we develop this ESG agenda. And we've internally scrutinised ourselves a lot on this, and I don't think we have all the solutions yet at all by any manner of means, and those solutions hopefully will evolve with time. But what we have tried to do is talk to our customers and work out what their pain points are, airlines, and then respond to that as well. So the dialogue has clearly started, and the time for action is well past. So that's what we're challenging ourselves to do, is to act in this respect.
Thanks, Orla. It's great. And over the last day and a half, there's certainly been a sentiment that the commitment piece has been done in the last 18 to 24 months, and now the action piece and delivery on those actions and demonstrating where you are relative to where you said you'd get is certainly to the fore. Maybe I might turn to you, Chris, just on that very point about actions. What would you say are the key levers available to not just the lessors, but the aviation as a sector as a whole, to help with that net zero trajectory to 2050 in, as Orla said, a hard-to-abate sector?
So I think it's important to look at the overall ecosystem first and what are the major contributing blocks and how to challenge them, and then you can think about how to have a joint or collaborative effort across operators, airports, air traffic control, lessors, etc., to get at that. So there's probably 3 or 4 big buckets to consider. One that gets talked about most is tailpipe CO2. The other one is contrails, which is basically man-made clouds. They usually form off high-altitude, long-haul flights. Then you've got a collection of smaller items that collectively add up around the ground operations and landing and takeoff cycle. And then you've got offsetting. Now, if I maybe just spend a quick introduction to each for those that might be new to it. So tailpipe CO2 gets a lot of the attention. In my mind, it gets 90+% of the talk. But actually, in terms of the carbon dioxide equivalent contributor from the sector, it's only about 40% of the total. And within that 40%, some gains can be made in terms of just better air traffic control use, better aerodrome rules. But to really tackle that 40% is a tough and a long-haul task because it requires scaling sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. It requires electrification of short-haul, smaller aircraft and hydrogen potentially for longer ones. So the certification process for those and the scaling them through the fleet on the one side, or scaling SAF production on the other side, that takes decades, and we need to be realistic about that. And that will come back to some PR considerations and the comms piece for the sector as well. If you look then at the contrail space, contrails is the largest single contributor to climate forcing from aviation, and yet it's not getting anywhere near 10 or 5% of the attention, in my view, yet. Now, in short, contrails, some airlines have started observing and monitoring and estimating what their contrail impact is. Nobody yet, as far as I know, is publicly reporting on it. The good news, however, is that contrails, relatively speaking to some of the other factors like scaling SAF, is an easy win out there if there's the political will and buy-in. So effectively, it's a weather and data science problem, and it's a flight planning problem. And so if the political will and the incentives were there, you could solve it this decade. Then in terms of the third bucket of the kind of a collection of, let's say, 10 to 15 tasks that could meaningfully eat into the carbon footprint today. Take one example from that, taxiing. A lot of taxiing today happens with one or even two of the engines that are designed for flight, not designed for taxiing. They're obviously not environmentally efficient at taxiing maneuvers. And yet the default solution is tugs, whether they're biofuel or electric or whatever, but those aren't operationally efficient. The tug might not be where you need it, when you need it, etc. And that just makes the whole airfield more crowded and so on. But the technology already exists there, and I'd call this the example of a low-hanging fruit. You can have a motorized nose wheel, for example, that effectively gives you that power to decarbonize the taxiing route and also brings airport efficiencies. And you see it being trialled in the likes of Düsseldorf Airport at the moment. And then lastly, in terms of offsetting, I think IATA put the estimate for 2050 in the net zero journey at about 10% or so. Our model suggests it's closer to 30-40% of the total solution by 2050 because the incentives just aren't there yet for the scaling of sustainable aviation fuel, and some of the other estimates around hydrogen and electrification's long-term impact just aren't yet realistic, at least in the 2050 timeline. And that really means if you're talking about 30-40% of the overall journey for aviation by mid-century, that's realistically beyond the scale of nature-based solutions that are out there. You're looking at every afforestation opportunity going, and obviously there's other sectors to compete with. So I think aviation needs to really start thinking about direct air carbon capture as well. So in a broad brush, I think those are the big pillars. Now, none of those sound like they're the core business of a lessor business today. I completely get that. And I predict that some lessors will completely remain outside of this sector and just be happy watching it happen. But at the same time, they know the sector well, and therefore, at least in theory, compared to other arm's length investors and institutional investors, they should be, they should have a leg up in terms of identifying which of those opportunities are actually profitable over that time frame. And therefore, I would predict that more and more lessors will get involved in those direct solutions, whether it's within the core entity or whether it's a side business, etc. And you can already see that starting. So the likes of Avalon set up a unit dedicated to small electrification for small short-haul flights.
Chris, great overview of the issues there and levers to help mitigate, particularly the climatic and environmental ones. Do we have the right focus, though, in terms of attention and mind's eye? Lots of press releases, lots of really good work happening around eVTOLs and how that agenda is moving on, and yet very little at least outside of academia, on contrails and the impact of the technical ability to mitigate contrails is, potentially less than a decade of flight pattern changes that's possible. How could we shift that dialogue to hang about now, everything else is good, but it's a long way away. This is something technologically that's in our grasp, but it's a regulatory thing, it's an airport thing, it's a flight patterns piece. How can we move that piece along? Because it seems like that could be something that would really capture people's imagination, that we don't have to dream for 20 years from now, which is something we can realistically do in the short term.
I think getting momentum in the short term is important in any sector. It shows that what can be done, and it sets a pace, etc. And you can see it in agriculture and other sectors as key. I don't know, honestly, why, in my view at least, the attention isn't proportional to the opportunities there to decarbonise today. But I do know in the overall topic of ESG and environment in particular over the last 10, 15 years, it does just feel like a lot of talk and communication and articulate communication needs to happen. Plain English, bite-sized visuals, etc. Just to get the thought process out there and make industry more aware, because it's completely understandable that most people in aviation, in aerospace, for example, have their day jobs, they're focused on that. And I think it is only by gentle reminders that we can start to shift that focus. And as you say, for example, maybe within the next decade that focus can be more proportional on, say, contrail mitigation versus what are the challenges for sailing SAF. And on the electrification side, for example, electric small aircraft are great, and for particular use cases like the ultra short haul market, they can make a meaningful impact by 2050. But because, in terms of which flights contribute most in terms of climate impact today, we just need to be realistic about how much of the overall needle that moves. So, let's say a Dublin to Donegal type route, or even Dublin Manchester, maybe Dublin London eventually, etc. Those type of routes can potentially be electrified by mid-century, but it's whether that contributes overall more than about 3-4% maybe of the total global commercial aviation's footprint. That's probably a challenge, and we just need to be realistic there. Yeah. You can completely understand that a lot of the startups in this space, their marketing gets ahead of the operations because they're reliant on investor appetite, etc. But for the more mature players in the space, operators and so on, we need to be careful that marketing doesn't get too far ahead of what they're actually doing in reality, because then you'll just open yourself to accusations of greenwashing and undermine the whole process.
Great, thanks, Chris. Maybe Anne, turning back to you to pull it back more into a lessor's perspective. Yeah. So Chris quite rightly said, look, not all lessors will be in a space to move at pace when it comes to this agenda, and that's fine. Every industry has leaders that want to move ahead. But from a lessor's perspective, what can you see as the near-term engagement piece for them in the ESG agenda?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that when you look at aviation, there is no stakeholder or stakeholder group which actually influences the entire ecosystem. Well, we all have an impact, but we're all relying upon each other. So I think it's important that we as lessor have a good understanding that we want to be part of this solution. So in other words, we have to contribute with whatever we can, as does everybody else, as has been touched upon. So that's really the starting point, that we are not the ones who are operating the aircraft, and hence we're not the ones creating the emission per se, but it doesn't change the fact that we are an integral player in this ecosystem, and consequently we have to act with whatever means we have. And if you look upon what characterizes the lessor community, well, the one big asset we have is, of course, capital. I mean, Chris touched upon it already, that maybe we could invest in other parts of the value chain, which is not what we are typically investing in today. I fully agree. I have no doubt that we will be seeing during the coming years that lessors will start investing in other parts of the value chain which are close to our activity, in order to progress the transition of our industry. So we will be investing, we will be incentivizing, we can incentivize our lessees, we can contribute to them effectively moving into, for example, the green fuels, the sustainable aviation fuels or SAF, in a more rapid pace than otherwise would have been the case. So from a lessor perspective, there is clearly a number of things we can do to influence, to invest and incentivize, and that's really we are doing and what we are increasingly looking to do. And I've no doubt that if you look forward the next couple of years, you'll see more and more activities. The challenge we have today as lessor community, as do a lot of other stakeholders, is quite frankly to identify suitable projects. What can we invest in? What can we do at this stage where it's all relatively early days, and consequently we are looking around and trying to find ways of acting, because that's really what is very much top of mind for a lot of lessors today. So I think we will be seeing more and more activity, and clearly lessors have a big role to play.
Certainly. Thank you, Jan. Maybe turning to you, Orla, just on one of Jan's points about the identification of projects, the identification of actions that are meaningful from a lessor's perspective. From an SMBC viewpoint, you've very, very large announcement that was recently on carbon offsetting for your customers. Maybe for the audience here, talk me through what that is actually and what it means for your customers and means for you. And you know, it's a front runner piece of activity and action that's tangible. Maybe give some flavour as to what that means.
Very happy to do that, Shane. So I mentioned that we have an innovation hub actually it was set up 4 years ago, and I suppose the ultimate rationale behind setting that up was to de-risk the business. And aircraft leasing hasn't changed very much in the 40 years that it's been in Ireland. Well, you know, we are the centre for aviation leasing in the world, but the process hasn't changed very much. So hence the rationale about setting up the Innovation Hub in SMBC Aviation Capital. And you know, we also really wanted to understand what the pain points of our customers were. And so we spoke to them a lot about what was really the biggest challenge facing them, and undoubtedly it is on the environmental side. And as Chris said, you know, there's a lot of solutions out there, but none of them may be readily available. And we looked into sustainable aviation fuels. We also looked at, you know, electric aircraft, hydrogen aircraft, and like everybody else knows, that is a long way off. But as Chris said as well, you know, carbon credits are something that can be done now. And we felt really that, as I mentioned there earlier, that we really wanted to act on this side of things. So we spent the last 20 months looking into how we could become actively involved in the whole carbon credit element and how we could offer that solution to our customers. So carbon credits are effectively, when an aircraft flies, it emits a tonne of CO2, and that is effectively offset somewhere else. So when people think about carbon credit projects, they mostly think about the growth of forests, growing trees, and how that then sequesters the carbon out of the atmosphere. But we wanted something that was a more ready solution, and I'll get to some of the compliance elements in a minute. But so we invested in environmental cook stoves across sub-Saharan Africa, across Southeast Asia and Central America. So our investment in total is over $53 million into these types of projects. And what really I suppose dictated that as well is not just the environmental impact that this can have, but also the social impact. So many of these projects align with the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of gender equality, in terms of climate action, and in terms of education. So there's a really positive social impact to investing in these projects as well. And we've actually spent time going out and visiting these projects too, and really getting an understanding of the project developers behind them, and really getting to know the partners that we're working with. You know, carbon credits and carbon offsetting is not all the same. And I guess there has been some perception out there in terms of greenwashing around this area. So what we really wanted to make sure of was that we were investing in the highest quality carbon offsetting schemes and carbon credit projects that we could. And so, that hence all of the due diligence that we've done around these projects has taken up a vast amount of our time. And what we really wanted to do for airlines was to take that piece of the hard work and do it for them. So that's why we have spent that amount of time in doing the due diligence around it. And CORSIA is the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, and that's going to become mandatory for airlines in 2027. So many airlines will need to offset and will need to offset their growth levels. I mean, there's been a lot of, coverage around this over the last couple of weeks. ICAO met in Montreal, and they set the baseline for CORSIA at growth emissions in 85% of 2019 levels. So hence airlines now know what they're dealing with. So many of our carbon credits will come on stream in 2026, just before CORSIA comes into play from a mandatory perspective. But I think CORSIA has gone some way. 115 countries are now signed up to it. But many airlines are actually going above and beyond CORSIA because they felt it didn't do enough. So that's where the voluntary carbon market comes into play. And that's all very positive. I mean, you've seen airlines like BA who've chosen to offset their domestic routes. Other airlines have spoken to us about just offsetting particular busy routes. So, it's certainly an area that airlines are, really grappling with now, but really trying to overcome. So.
Good. No, it's a super initiative, and certainly getting a lot of airplay and attraction, quite rightly. So within the role that I have, working with clients, Scope 3 emission data is a key element of what we do, and trying to understand what that baseline is, and then work through methodology to try and reduce that over time. One of the key problems we have around Scope 3 is data integrity, right? And not only within the business themselves, but you're now relying on supply chain, people in your value chain rather, and their data. For you on the offsetting piece, talk us through a little bit how you manage that data piece. And I know from 2026 onwards it's going to kick in, so you've got that breathing space. How important is that data integrity piece for the market?
I think it's hugely important, and there's a lot of discussion around Scope 3. Is it Scope 1 for an airline? Is it Scope 3 for a lessor? But in essence, as long as we are doing something about scope, whether it's Scope 1 or Scope 3, that's the positive thing. I mean, there's so much room for double counting across all of these areas, but I think I've heard a lot of people say, does that really matter when it comes to the environment? And I don't think it really does. Whether it's happening at Scope 1 or Scope 3, it's the important that it is happening. And so the data is hugely important, and we have invested ourselves in getting access to that data, and which is also, so the airline themselves will measure the emissions, and we can assist them also by measuring as well, so we have access to that data. And then we can assist the airlines in terms of knowing, well, how much has been offset, and applying that to the data as well. So it's just an extra layer of integrity, I guess, in terms of measuring the data, but it's hugely important. And I know there's lots of talk around this area at the moment. What's the right standard? What's the right metric? But the fact is that the measurement is happening as well, and that's a really positive start.
Great, super. Chris, in the options and levers that you mentioned earlier for the wider industry, they're clear. There's a timeline. Some of them are going to be more further out than others. What about the uniformity of pace globally? I mean, is there different pockets that regions or countries, or even down to company level initiatives that are that bit more ahead? And can we leapfrog and learn from these businesses?
Yeah, so obviously aviation has been able to scale and safely scale over the last century because of international harmonisation, and that remains important for the sector. And you don't want, for example, incentives that basically push away international airlines or give local favouritism and so on. So that's obviously a factor, and you can see recently how long it took ICAO, for example, basically to come out with still a fairly high-level statement about where they want to go to, lacking on maybe specifics at the moment, to see how difficult it is to corral the 150 plus member states required. I think the good news is that a lot more can be done at national and regional levels anyway, that don't have those harmonisation issues that aviation needs to be mindful of. So one of the big challenges I said earlier was around scalability of SAF. Biofuels in particular have a scalability challenge. Our modelling would suggest, by mid-2030s, basically they're going to max out for a number of geopolitical and also just practical commercial availability issues. That's about 5% of the total energy demand for the sector we see. In contrast, synthetic fuel or power to liquid can scale much beyond that and can be the long-term solution, but really needs a lot of investment in it. And now so far, for example, you have the EU and EU states pushing demand mandates on SAF. You have some US states trying to incentivize production instead on this SAF side. And then you've got a hodgepodge of other regions and voluntary announcements elsewhere. The biggest challenge there really is the scalability on the production side. We know in 10, 15 years, the demand for SAF is already going to be outstripping the supply. Mm-hmm. And therefore, let's say the current EU approach, in my opinion, won't work without also incentives on the production side. And production side incentives are really about the energy sector as opposed to just the aviation sector. So, I don't see any downside in trying to incentivize synthetic fuel scaling in one region or one country, as long as it's an open market in terms of fulfilling its own airport needs, but also ability to export, etc. And there's no favoritism on that front. I don't see why the EU and particular member states wouldn't want to push that. And the beauty about synthetic or power to liquid fuel is that, any country with access to low carbon generation can get involved. Obviously, it's complex in the scale of it and so on. There are hurdles, serious hurdles to get through, and that's why you need collaboration across the sector. But it needs to start with policy-led incentives. And maybe with war in Europe over the last year as well, it's more topical now in terms of energy security. You take Ireland as a specific example. We've got a lot of wind power contributing to the grid relative to a lot of Western countries. Wind power is famously difficult to integrate to grid because when you need electricity and when it happens to be windy, it don't align. So wind and solar are the types of low carbon generation that's more ideal, more actually suited to synthetic fuel production, for example. And there's no reason why, for example, Ireland couldn't be a champion of that, fulfill its own kerosene needs with synthetic fuel and also export elsewhere.
Great. Over the last 2 days, in various webinars on Climate Finance Week, there's the Climate Action Plan has come into focus a lot, and the various elements of it, particularly the bill nationally and privately and personally that we as citizens will have to foot for this climate change response. It's really interesting to hear that piece about SAF, that we're no longer thinking about Middle Eastern fuel, or we're no longer thinking of regional pockets of fossil fuel, that we can have a disruptive market when it comes to sustainable aviation fuels. And Ireland may find itself with some element of energy security. And not many of the dialogues that I've heard in the last day and a half around Climate Action Plan show that linkage. We talk about electricity and the funding necessary for that. We don't necessarily have, that excess electricity piece could fuel, or forgive the pun, develop SAF. And it'd be great if we had that piece of linkage. And maybe to you, Jan, on that piece of linkage and the notion of having unified voice or unified message, particularly from lessors. You're hugely influential. You are, from an Aviation Lessors Ireland perspective, 50% of all aircraft, I think, are part of the organisation. So a big voice there. How important is having a unified voice within the sector?
Well, it's certainly key, no doubt about that. And just to put it into perspective, you mentioned it yourself. I mean, the lessor community effectively owns more than half of the global aviation fleet. And it so happens that if you look upon the EU, there are more aircraft owned in the EU than they're operated. Mm-hmm. And of course, primarily owned out of Ireland, as you well know. So all in all, you can say that the aircraft lessor community is a very important voice in all of this. And that was also what drove that we joined forces and effectively went together when it came to ESG for Aircraft Leasing Ireland. The fact that we can now speak with one voice, we have 36 members, including 18 of the 20 largest on a global scale. The fact that we can speak with the one voice, of course, resonates much better whether we are talking about governments, whether we are talking about investor stakeholder groups. So from our perspective, it was key that we took this step, and it's already proven that it was the right step to take. And of course, when we are talking about something like SAF development, for example, in Ireland, it would be natural that Aircraft Leasing Ireland plays an active role, as indeed we are doing as we speak. So all in all, this dimension of speaking with one voice, it's key, no doubt about that.
Wonderful, thanks, Jan. A lot of what we've talked about is the opportunity piece where we can get to and so on and so forth, but in the short to medium term, there are risks for the sector, and maybe Orla, just as from your perspective, what do you see as the short-term risks within the sector if we don't start to move and mobilise on making that piece from commitment to action across the various agenda?
It's a huge risk, not acting, really, isn't it? And I suppose from the perspective as well, is taking that first step is critical for corporates that haven't done that. You know, I think as Jan said, the collaborative piece, the scale of the capital that aircraft leasing commands is a huge positive as well, and it's about making the right decision as well around how that capital can be channeled. Certainly to upscale SAF and sustainable aviation fuels is a huge imperative. The risks, of course, are numerous. I think from a legislation point of view, you know, we're faced with a number of potential, you know, whether it's higher taxes in regards to using aviation fuel. You know, so we need really to act. And I was listening to Willie Walsh the other day talking about how, you know, this and the climate agenda will result in higher airfares. And I alluded to earlier on as well that, you know, if we don't act, the repercussions of that are big for the sector. It'll deter potentially people from flying, but aviation is such a positive for society as well. So it's important, therefore, that we really don't risk that. So if people feel that either their flight is being offset as they fly, or they know that perhaps 50% of the flight is flown on sustainable aviation fuel, or there are other, you know, positive aspects about what they're doing in flying that day, or it may be, that I think that'll be a really positive from a reputational point of view for airlines, but also across the wider ecosystem and the sector. And somebody told me, I think, that they flew on a JetBlue flight recently, and that at the end of the flight said, you know, your flight has been 100% offset. So, I mean, that's certainly a real positive for customers and passengers who are taking a flight that day, be it to go on holidays or whatever it might be. So it's really important that airlines, that manufacturers like Airbus and Boeing, that we all work together to come up with those types of solutions, and that aircraft leasing is firmly in that too, in that discussion.
Very good, thanks, Orla. Chris, just turning to you then to just tease out that risk piece a bit more. the risks aren't really going to go away. We can nibble away at them and take bite-sized chunks when the opportunity is there for us to do so. From your perspective within the wider aviation sector, what do we have to get right? What is the sequence of making sure Jan's aspirations of a uniform voice is there from lessors? What are the steps that need to happen?
Maybe in the short term, I think we need to do ourselves more favours in terms of how we communicate it. So the comms piece about the challenges and what is likely to happen in the short term versus medium and long term needs to be articulately made. I think, to be honest, aviation's losing the PR battle at the moment. Flight shaming, you've mentioned. I've had serious conversations with otherwise sane people who are suggesting that I should have a mandated number of flights per year, or that flights on particular routes should be banned, etc. And we've got great cultural and economic benefits from aviation, and those are worth fighting for. So it's around perspective. Yeah, I mean, how often, given the attention on aviation, how often do you hear it that in relative terms, it's a sector that roughly emits the same as data centers and the related ICT infrastructure, or that it's much less than, say, the protein industry? So I think, making too much, to my point earlier about marketing getting ahead, if you make too much of a song and dance about a single test flight being on SAF when 0.0 whatever % of your fuel burn for that year was actually SAF, that only lends yourself to, a backlash, I think. So it's about getting into the easier quick wins for early momentum, and then some of the longer term challenges that will need a collaborative partnership approach. So maybe in the short term, for example, whether I'm a passive investor, like an air finance community, or whether I'm an OEM or an operator, etc., it's what are the quick wins, let's say, in the taxi operations, in air traffic control side. Now, that's where we can maybe turn the attention and heat back on some of the policymakers, because there's a lot of inefficiencies in air traffic today that really come down to sovereignty issues. So it's a political will issue, and also flexibility in terms of dynamic airspace with military needs, for example. So in the likes of Europe, it's all well and good, the EU, talking targets for the sector, but at an EU level, they've talked single skies for a couple of decades, and there's not that much implemented on it to date. So when, let's say, 10 French air traffic controllers go on strike, not only are lots of flights cancelled, but those that do fly are maybe burning 20-30% extra fuel just because of airspace rules. So there are lots of short-term and relatively quick fixes there. Contrails is another one. You don't need, if you really care about this as an airline, you don't need to wait for an international policy framework, etc. You're talking about a small percentage of your long-haul flights, very small changes in altitude at the right level, etc. It's not a material cost in a relative scheme of things. The fuel burn penalty, etc., is less than 1%, most likely in most cases. So I think there are those things that should be done more this decade. At the same time, though, you do need SAF, you do need electrification, you do need hydrogen, and clearly if you don't spend any attention on them today, you won't be there by 2050 either. But it's a very mammoth task, and so the sector needs to be realistic, again, and point the finger back at policymakers, for example. Well, where are the incentives to scale production of SAF, for example, and working with regulators in terms of what is a safe but efficient way to certify new aircraft and allow them to scale through fleet.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. I'm very much enjoying the dialogue here with the guys in the panel, but I'm conscious that there are people down the wires. If you've got questions to submit, please do so. I can see them here coming through on my iPad if you send in those questions. And while we're giving you a chance to put those questions to us, maybe just a closing word to you, Jan. So this is Aircraft Leasing Ireland supported session in Climate Finance Week. Next week, big inaugural Sustainability Day for ALI. Maybe talk us through the day, what the objective is, and what do you hope to achieve from next week?
Very happy to. Let's just take a step back. I mean, we came out with our narrative back in January of this year, effectively describing the pathway of aviation to net zero by 2050. And part of that narrative was that we came out with a number of action points, and those are the ones we are now delivering on, or in the process of delivering on. There were a couple of key action points for this year. One was the Global Aviation Sustainability Day, as you say, which will take place Thursday of next week, and I'll come back to that in a second, but the other important point was a charter for Aircraft Leasing Ireland. Basically, our ambition was to come up with a framework which would be tailor-made for our members, and it would effectively allow us to, streamline the reporting of our industry, and effectively also help us on the goal setting of our industry and our members. So there was a number of objectives surrounding the charter which were important for us, and we viewed it as the cornerstone of our activity this year. And that will be launched Thursday of next week. Mm-hmm. So that's an important step from our perspective, and quite frankly, it's a first in aviation to come out with such a charter. So it's a milestone for us, no doubt about that. But that brings me back to the Global Aviation Sustainability Day, and what we are doing when it comes to the Global Aviation Sustainability Day is that we've been mindful of a few things. We wanted to make sure that we controlled the agenda. We wanted to create a broad agenda where we cover as much as we can of the value chain, so it doesn't become too narrow, too specific, for example, on ESG reporting. So it's a fairly broad agenda. We cover regulation of governments, we cover SAF, we cover obviously the airlines, we cover the different technology pathways and so on. So there's a very broad agenda for the day. The other thing we were mindful of doing was to come up with a setting which was fostering collaboration. So we seek to bring in a number of stakeholders from all parts of the value chain. And we find that in the past, that's the way we get inspired. That's how we as lessor community hopefully get ideas as to how can we move forward? What can we do to be part of the solution here? So you can say it'll be a day of collaboration and inspiration. So that's really the Global Aviation Sustainability Day.
Great.
So we can only encourage that you'll be there Thursday of next week.
Good stuff, Jan. Thank you very much indeed. All right, let me just have a quick look and see if questions have come through. So, controversial one. So, aside from SAF development, what about banning intercontinental flights right now? Will planes still push for fossil fuels? So, I think that's a case if you didn't fly, what would happen? So, not terribly sure who wants to take that one on board, but I think the question is, how could we advance the SAF development piece beyond what we're doing already?
Well, I think if I
covered it. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead, Jan.
Yeah,
No,
I
go
think
ahead.
Chris has covered it to a large degree. I mean, we see two approaches taking place right now. We see the incentivizing approach taking place in the US, and then we have a framework or a mandate approach which is taking place in the EU. And it's very clear that the development of SAF is now moving towards the US, because if you are into that development, of course you're going to go where you have the most attractive framework, and that's clearly in the US. And what's striking to us is that if you look back in time and you look upon what the EU did in the past, the reason why we have, for example, wind power where it is today, the reason for that was, quite frankly, that EU incentivized wind power. Had that not been the case, there was no way that we would have been anywhere close to where we are today. Mm-hmm. Today we are at a situation where the cost of wind power is actually less than the fossil equivalent. If you had said that to anybody back in the 80s or 90s, they would have taken you away in a straitjacket. So there was no way that people saw this coming, and here we are today. And that was thanks to incentive programs in the EU. So from that perspective, it's a little bit strange that we are not seeing any kind of incentive programs in the EU, especially at this stage. Mm-hmm. That's really where we need it. So from that perspective, clearly there are things which can be done, and I think especially in the EU, we're doing a lot, and there's a lot of good work going on, but what's lacking in the incentivizing of the SAF manufacturing.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jan.
Shane, just to add to that as well, I guess you have seen a lot of corporates scrutinising their travel, you know, and obviously with COVID and all of that, we saw effectively how, you know, the engagement can work across teams. But I also think that people do need to factor in a certain amount of travel into what they do. But corporates are far more conscious about that. And I think that's a good thing as well. So if you don't absolutely need to fly, you know, should you? And to ask yourself the question as well at the same time. But you've seen actually domestically in France, you know, as well, new changes encouraging people not to fly, to take a train, to go the electric route, you know, where they can. And I think that's a positive too, because it all works in the main. But also in terms of aviation, looking at it from a door-to-door perspective too, and I know we've seen, you know, moves into the eVTOL space, and you know, so aviation and airlines are looking at the whole trip rather than just, you know, the flight itself. So, you know, how are customers or passengers when they leave their door, you know, what are they doing? Are they taking maybe when the time is right an electric aircraft to the airport? You know, how is it all working? So there's lots of different ways that we can look around this, and I think that's where the creative aspect and the innovation aspect comes into it quite a lot. Wonderful.
Thanks, Orla. Okay, I think we're coming close to our time to close on the session. From my perspective, the opening commentary that the aviation sector has its challenges when it comes to climate space, I think, and I hope through this session you've learned that there are a whole host of mitigation measures, a whole host of actions, both nationally, regionally and internationally, working on this agenda. And the guests here today really put it quite succinctly what options are available, but more importantly, what they're actually doing now. So the unified voice that Jan mentioned is hugely important. The steps that Orla has taken in SMBC in relation to the carbon discounting options, and the international view that Chris brought to us from all the various different value chain aspects in the aviation sector are all, you know, positives. Not without risks, clearly, and the 2050 agenda seems a long, long way away, but there are incremental pieces that can be brought forward if we get the policies right, if we get the regulatory environment right, if we get the incentives right. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you very much enjoyed the remainder of the Climate Finance Week agenda. It's very, very promising next couple of days ahead. And for me, all it remains to say is thank you very much to my guests today. Hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Thank you very much.